My name's Andy Williams, and for about the last 10 years or so, I've been focused on helping develop US-UK cyber relationships. And that's primarily in the field of international trade in cybersecurity, so doing business as opposed to the operational relationship, which is developed through many organizations, CREST being one. And I've known CREST for a long time, and in fact, for 3 years I was based out in Washington, DC as the UK cyber envoy, and Roland and his predecessor worked very closely with us when we were bringing teams of UK companies over to the US to be kind of educated and engaged in the US cybersecurity market. So in the next 20 minutes or so, I'm going to talk about the fact that the US government announced its new national cybersecurity strategy just about 3 or 4 weeks ago. And here we are in London, at CRESTCon Europe. Why are we talking about the US? I hear you ask. Well, as you all know, in many walks of life, what happens in the US today often happens in the rest of the world tomorrow. And that's certainly true in cybersecurity in many ways. And some of that is driven by what the government is actually developing as new policy and strategy to support the industry. So that's what I'm going to be talking about. I will make an apology up front to say that my slides are very wordy, unfortunately. You can read them for yourselves. But the reason for that is it's not a good idea to misquote governments on cybersecurity strategy, I've found in the past. So you'll see anything in quotation marks in my presentation is directly extracted from the National Cybersecurity document, which is publicly available. One of the things about the US cybersecurity world is that they publish a ton of stuff online. The government is very open in terms of what it's doing publicly. Just a quick word about who I'm representing today. So I mentioned that I'd been working for about the last 10 years in transatlantic cybersecurity relationships, building them up. But for the last 2 years, I've been working as a co-founder of the Transatlantic Cybersecurity Business Network, which is what it says on the tin. It's a special interest group formed of cyber vendors who have an interest in doing business in the UK to the US and from the US to the UK. And these are some of our members, some of our partners, I should say. Global Transatlantic is actually my cybersecurity business. I'm actually a board advisor to a number of cybersecurity companies through that company. Clarity is a digital communications specialist in the US and around the world. And they actually manage the secretariat of the Transatlantic Cybersecurity Business Network for us. That's what their expertise is in. They also run, for example, the Internet Service Providers Association in the UK, the Health Tech Alliance, InsurTech UK, and many other tech special interest groups. Now, Plexil you might know as the UK government's delivery partner for cybersecurity innovation programs, such as the NCSC Cybersecurity Accelerator Program. And I guess I don't need to tell you who CREST are. So those are some of our founding partners. We've been going now for about 2 years, and we're up to about 70 members who have an interest in US-UK cyber business relationships. You can see some of them there. It's free to join TCBN. And in fact, Christian and Kriya are here, and they'll be down at the stand that we have in the room there. And they will be happy to sign you up or take questions on, the wider remit of TCBN. But what I want to get in the next 15 to 20 minutes is what's going on in the US, and in particular, what's coming out of the new cybersecurity strategy. So I thought I'd have my slide here. I don't, so I'm just going to stand this side so I can see it a bit better. All right, so it's kind of interesting, this iteration of the US National Cybersecurity Strategy, because the US government has fundamentally changed its thinking about how to go about protecting the US. And it's driving a lot of the changes that will be happening going forward. And so one of the the ways of achieving this overarching aim to secure the full benefits of a safe and secure digital ecosystem is to look at rebalancing the responsibility to defend cyberspace by shifting the burden for cybersecurity away from individuals and small businesses and local government to what the US government says are organizations that are most capable and best positioned to reduce risk for all of us. So who are these organizations that should be taking responsibility for cybersecurity in the US? We'll talk about that in a moment. But the other fundamental shift in their thinking is around the fact that they realize that the whole of the cybersecurity world typically is fundamentally focused on facing and solving the cybersecurity challenges of today. You know, we're in the trenches, up to our neck in mud and bullets, trying to defend the US, the UK, the rest of the world from cyber attack. And up until now, both in the UK and the US, I would say, there isn't a lot of thought that has gone into trying to identify the risks that are on the horizon that might not necessarily be the risks that we need to deal with today, but if we're not aware of them and starting to plan for them, could become very central to everything that happens in the country. So it's looking at rebalancing the responsibility of who we hold responsible for defending cyberspace and realigning incentives to favor long-term investments by striking this balance between how much we can focus on today's challenges to allow us to focus on also the challenges coming down the pipe. So there's kind of a bold statement in the new strategy, which, as I say, indicates this kind of change in thinking, which is that today end users bear too great a burden for mitigating cyber risks. You know, individuals, small businesses, even state and local government in the US have limited resources and other priorities. So who are these organizations that we, when I say we, I mean the US government, are saying we should hold responsible for protecting the country from cybersecurity attacks? And effectively, it boils down to any organization that holds large amounts of data, or organizations that develop technology platforms that data is held on. So I think what we're going to see there, doesn't state this explicitly here in the brief overview, is an increasing trend towards regulation and legislation to enforce those organizations that hold very large amounts of public and customer data, or the technology platforms that they reside on. Okay, so now that they've identified who the organizations are that are more likely to be held accountable by the US government, what is the US government going to do in order to help fund and support some of the forward thinking that will allow us to be in a situation, for example, let's say if we look at ransomware, you know, ransomware has been around certainly in the US for the best part of 10 years, and yet the US government and its partners in 36 countries and plus the EU around the world have only recently got together to collaborate on what they're calling the Counter-Ransomware Initiative, and I'll talk a little bit more about that shortly. If they've been having those conversations and those collaborations, you know, 10, 15 years ago, I think it's fair to say that we'd be in a better position today to address the ransomware threats that, you know, every country is suffering from. So the federal government is going to be making what they call generational investments in renewing infrastructure, digitizing and decarbonizing energy systems, etc., as you can see from that. So the document itself, it's about 35 pages, very intense text. I've tried to pull out some of the most interesting points, I think, from a UK audience. But the whole of the strategy document is based around these 5 pillars. It's interesting for any of you that are familiar with the UK National Cybersecurity Strategy, which was published last year. They also based around 5 pillars. You say, well, that's great. There's some alignment of thinking between the US and the UK. The only issue is that the 5 pillars that the US identified, you see here, if you go to the National Cybersecurity Strategy document published by the NCSC last year, it's a different 5 pillars. But there is also a lot of commonality of thought. So what I'm going to do, for each of the 5 pillars, there are about 5 or 6 objectives that the US government is saying they want to achieve over this next period of 5 years or so. I literally don't have time to go into all of them, so I'm going to pick one initiative from each of the 5 pillars because I think it's particularly interesting and relevant to an audience of primarily technical specialists. So the first pillar is all about defending critical infrastructure. And you can see here some of the objectives that they hope to achieve. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to focus, because a lot of what I do is help companies understand the opportunities coming out from these strategies that they can exploit to develop their business. I'm going to look at Objective 1.5, which is all about modernizing the federal defenses. Because one of the fundamental problems that the US government has is it's seen by the industry in many ways as an organization that says, don't do as I do, do as I say. Because, frankly, the US government itself has been guilty of making many of the wrong assumptions and developing many of the weaknesses in the ecosystem that have created a problem for society historically. However, what are they going to do about that? Well, they're going to spend a bunch of money. I think this year they're looking to spend 10.7 billion. This is just amongst federal agencies. And next year it's going to increase by about 14%, which is a significant increase in the current climate of spending cutbacks. And you can see there some of the top 24 agencies and what slice of the cake they'll be getting. But effectively, what the government is saying is that the Office of Management and Budget, which holds the budget for cybersecurity in the US, and its Zero Trust Architect strategy, will direct federal agencies to implement multi-factor authentication, to encrypt their data, to gain visibility into their entire attack surface, to manage authentication and access, and to adopt cloud security tools. So that kind of gives us an indication of where there will be an appetite to spend more money in the coming years to protect the government, and particularly the government's federal, the federal infrastructure. Okay, so that's pillar 1. They're going to spend a bunch more money. Pillar 2 is all about the need to disrupt and dismantle threat actors. And again, I won't read all of these, you can see them for yourselves. But these are all about limiting cybercrime, typically, or addressing cybercrime. And I'm just going to spend a couple of minutes talking about one of the initiatives that you should be aware of, which is all about countering cybercrime, and particularly defeating ransomware. So I mentioned that ransomware has been around in the US for the last 10 years or so. It has got to what some people will call epidemic proportions now, but it's been happening, particularly ransomware attacks on the US healthcare system. It's been happening for a long time. So 10 years later, the US government, the White House, coordinated a meeting of, I think it was 36 countries plus the EU countries. And in 2022, last year, they decided a whole number of actions which together would enable greater and more effective collaboration between ally partners on addressing the ransomware challenge. Again, won't read through all of these, but you can see that they are bringing the countries together. They're creating a task force which will actually be led by Australia. developing an investigator toolkit with tactics, techniques, and procedures that will help address the ransomware challenge. They will be issuing joint advisories as and when necessary, outlining which tools and techniques can be used against key identified actors. And they're building a capacity building tool, which is all about, primarily about helping countries which don't currently yet have a level of maturity in their national cyber infrastructures to be able to address ransomware attacks effectively themselves without help from other countries. And they're also, in order to affect the collaboration, running these twice yearly counter-ransomware exercises where they learn a lot from each other about what works, what doesn't work in addressing ransomware attacks. It's very early days for the initiatives, but there are already signs that this increased collaboration between the US and its allied partners is delivering results. And as just one example, back in January, the US government announced a takedown of the Hive ransomware group, which is one of the world's 5 largest ransomware groups. And last year, it victimized over 1,300 companies and received over $100 million in ransomware payments. And through this initiative, law enforcement agencies from 13 countries were involved in the successful takedown effort. So as you can see, there is some progress. There's a lot more work to be done, but now at least they've got a collaborative body that is sharing information that allows countries to become more adept at dealing with ransomware attacks. So on to Pillar 3, which is all about shaping market forces. And there's a whole bunch of initiatives that you can see there, including what needs to be done, for example, to make IoT devices more secure. I think Roland mentioned earlier the Secure by Design initiatives in both countries that are taking place. I'm just going to focus on Objective 3.6 because it's kind of fascinating to me that the US government for the first time is saying that it needs to take a view on the extent of its involvement, potentially, in the cybersecurity insurance industry, given everything that's going on in the world. So what the government is saying is that they will, they haven't put a timescale on it, but they will engage with industry, with regulators, with Congress in the US, industry stakeholders, to decide what, if any, stance the US government needs to take. And the whole reason why they're looking at this is that in the spirit of looking ahead and trying to get in front of problems before they actually manifest themselves as attacks, they are looking into what would happen, for example, if there was a catastrophic cybersecurity problem that affected the stability of the economy. You know, we've seen recently that the US government in recent years has stepped in to effectively save the financial services industry when it's got into major problems. What would the government stance need to be if it were to be asked to prop up the cybersecurity insurance industry because so many claims were being made as a result of some form of catastrophic attack? And it's kind of interesting to me that this is actually being thrown into sharp focus by recent announcements coming out of the cyber insurance industry, particularly, for example, from Lloyd's, that are telling their insurers that all policies going forward must contain clauses explicitly that exclude losses arising from war, declared or otherwise. Yeah, sure.
Sorry, if I may. So does that mean that the government's going to step in and confirm attribution?
The government is going to agree to talk about what they think needs to be done. So they're not making any decisions right now that there is a role for the government as a backstop to prop up the insurance industry, cyber insurance industry. But there's been a breakthrough in thinking because they're saying this is an issue that the government can't step back from because of its potentially very significant consequences if there were to be a major catastrophic attack that affected large parts of the economy. I'm in for time. Okay, Pillar 4. This is for me, a very timely example of how the US government is changing its focus from let's throw all of our time, effort, and money at solving today's problems to looking at a potentially existential problem coming down the track, which is the development of quantum computing. You know, quantum computing has got lots of fantastic potential benefits coming out of it in terms of the massive uptick in processing power that quantum computers will be able to deliver. But it also has a very fundamental risk attached to it, which is it will potentially wipe out the encryption industry, because quantum computers will be able to break any encryption algorithm in a very short space of time, which means, worst case scenario, that we wake up tomorrow and all of the data that is encrypted around the world is effectively no longer safe, because it can be decrypted by hostile actors if they got access to very powerful quantum computers. So the US government is acknowledging that, and what they've done is they've passed into law an act which is going to force federal agencies to effectively get their act together to come up with plans to address the post-quantum threat. And this will create a lot of opportunity for the cybersecurity industry, because one of the things, for example, that the Office of Management and Budget will be asking each federal agency to do is identify all of their IT and OT assets and prioritize them in terms of which ones they think they should be protecting first. And frankly, the US government, like lots of large organizations, doesn't have a 100% handle on all of the IT assets it owns. So I guess they'll be looking to industry to help them with that, with the tools required. And they'll all need to come up with a plan to migrate from current algorithms onto quantum-safe algorithms. And for the last 6 years, there's been a competition driven by NIST to invite algorithm experts, encryption experts, to come up with quantum-safe encryption technologies. And currently, there are 3 or 4 shortlisted, and there'll be, somewhere down the track, there'll be an announcement by the US government as to which quantum-safe algorithms they'll be enforcing federal agencies to use. But typically, even though all of that activity and legislation will be around forcing the government agencies to get their act together on quantum computing, the strategy document does say the private sector should follow the government's model in preparing its own networks and systems for our post-quantum future, in other words. And this is, again, what typically happens, something that the government decides to do to support, to protect the government, over time, gets put out to industry, so that industry themselves have to get an act together. I see that as a great opportunity for cybersecurity companies, particularly CRESTCon members, to actually help private industry develop plans to make their own systems quantum safe. Finally, there's a lot more talk in the strategy about international partnerships, as you'd expect. We talked about the counter-ransomware initiative as being one example of that. I'm just going to end with one kind of insight into what's going on in Ukraine. As you can imagine, there's a lot happening amongst allied countries, particularly NATO members, to help Ukraine protect the country from cyber attacks internally and externally. And here's a whole bunch of things that they're doing, including spending some serious money, for example, launching a $38 million reform program to strengthen Ukraine's cybersecurity legal and regulatory environment, its workforce development, and to strengthen connections between critical infrastructure operators and private sector solution providers. And most recently, in February, USAID, which is the International Development Agency of the US government, has announced a plan to invest a further $60 million to help strengthen cybersecurity in Ukraine. And this is a real live example of how the US government is kind of increasing its international collaboration focus, particularly in light of what they believe needs to happen to help the Ukraine in its current challenges. Yeah, I think that's it. I think I've kind of just about run out of time, unfortunately.
Absolutely.
However, having said all of that, I'm here all day, and Christian and Kriya will be our stand. If I'm not around and anybody wants to have a follow-up conversation on any of this with me today, or to arrange a conversation going forward, if I'm not on the stand, Christian and Kriya will be able to put you in touch with me. I'll be more than happy to talk to you about any of the specific elements of what I've described today. So with that, I'll
Awesome.
wrap it
Thanks,
up, I
Andy.
guess.
No, that was great. The sort of thing I think you could probably go a lot longer on. Interestingly, Australia